Hi everybody, it's Whitney from All the Shelves. I'm coming to you from a very snowy, dark day to give you a wrap up of the first 2 weeks of February. I have my yellowish orange lighting, hopefully you can see my face enough, and here are the list of books that I read in the first half of February. The first novel that I finished in February was A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, and I did a full, quite lengthy review on this book, so I don't really want to talk more about it. I'll link that video down below, and I've gotten some really interesting responses in that video, so you should read the comment section too if you're interested in like how people are thinking about this book. But basically I just thought that it was a really smart exploration of the process of reading and how we are actually responding to it, and so it's like very overblown, over the top, quite unrealistic, but I thought that it was quite a satisfying read in a way that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with myself for being so satisfied while I was reading it, or at least being so intrigued and invested in it. I've been listening to a lot on audiobook these first 2 weeks of February, and that's because my running mileage has increased, so I thought it appropriate to finally listen to Haruka Murakami's What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. I have some issues with Murakami. I love his writing style. I've read everything that he's written, at least everything that has been translated into English, but he has a very particular sexism, I think, that I really respond negatively to. For example, when I was reading 1Q84, about halfway through the book, I noticed just how often he was referencing breasts and boobs and chests. I mean, it was every description of a female character. He also had to tell us what their boobs looked like. It was very strange, and I started underlining and highlighting all the times that I found boobs, and just now I did a Google like book search, and there were like at least 45 instances of him talking about women's breasts. It was, I mean, absurd, right? And I can't understand why he's doing it except for just like he likes boobs. There didn't really seem to be a narrative purpose for it. And in this book, what I talk about when I talk about running, I was finding instances of that same kind of sexism. Even though it was a memoir about him running, he had like these instances where he would see girls running on the street too, and he would just assume the reason that they were running was not as serious as him, and that their running was coming from a place of like wanting to look better for men. So he like talks about how these blonde girls from Harvard run past him with ponytails swinging or something like that, and how his running is somehow more important or more meaningful than their running. Well, I am a girl who runs with a ponytail, and when he was listing what his mileage was for serious running, I don't want to be a braggart here, but my mileage is higher. So for him to just assume these things about girls that are running by him on the street is just so obnoxious. And at the beginning of the book he claims that he's not competitive at all, but those little competitive streaks are coming through, and they're coming through in expressions of his like superiority as a man. So obnoxious, but I don't want to say that the book isn't worth reading, because there were some things that I really identified with when he was talking about discipline and his writing life and how his running life and his writing life are interconnected. That really spoke to me, because that's the reason that I run, is to sort of work through writing problems. Oh, and there was one other thing that I didn't really like. The narrator didn't seem to really know that much about running, so he was putting stress on weird words. Like, for example, Murakami was talking about how he ran an Olympic distance triathlon, which is long. I'm not going to say that that's not an accomplishment, but the narrator seemed to think that the word Olympic was the important part of the sentence, when there are lots of triathlon distance a lot greater. And in fact, Murakami goes on to talk about Ironman distances, and the narrator just sort of like, you know, busts through it. So it's like, I ran an Olympic distance triathlon versus like, oh, and I'm thinking of running an Ironman, no big deal. So those were really nitpicky little things, and I think if you weren't a runner or not experienced with triathlons, you would not really find those annoying, but I certainly did. Okay, whew, enough about running, right? Enough about Murakami. Moving right along. The other audiobook that I listened to in these first 2 weeks of February was The Cuckoo's Calling. Now this one is really long. It's like 13 discs, and I just busted through these. It was so enjoyable. I wasn't expecting it to be as good as it was. It was just a really solid thriller and mystery, and what I realized as I was listening to it is that Harry Potter, every book in the Harry Potter series is a mystery too. She sets you up at the beginning of the book with some sort of like big mystery for Harry and his friends to unpack, and then like slowly clues emerge and they sort of put it all together until at the end the villain sort of reveals his plan in that traditional detective story trope. So it makes perfect sense that these books would also be really good. I loved the main character, Cormoran Strike. I loved his secretary, Robin, and her struggle with her relationship with Strike and how she's a little bit subservient to him but always wants to show initiative to kind of like work her way up. This week where I lived, the pollution was so bad that I had to run on an indoor track, and it was like 5.5 times around for a mile, so I was going like 33 times around this thing just to get to 6 miles, and you know, it's very repetitive, and it really helped to just zone out, and I actually really looked forward to my runs just because I was listening to this book. So thank you, J.K. Rowling or Robert Galbraith or whatever you want me to call you. That was really helpful. A book I read for school and that I mentioned I was reading in my Friday Reads video a little while back is The Sociology of Culture by Raymond Williams. I don't have much to say about this. I needed to read it to pull some quotations for a paper that I was writing, but really we have done so much with cultural materialism from the time that this was written. It felt kind of derivative even though it was the first, but that was just because of my reading order. So I totally respect Raymond Williams, and I think it's amazing how he helped craft this new movement in literary criticism, but this is not necessarily a book that I would recommend you read. I think there are books that have been written since the publication of this one that are more worthwhile. One of my goals of the year was to read more plays, and so I read Noises Off by Michael Frayn. I just randomly picked this up at my library. I was looking somewhere else and this caught my eye, so I picked it up. It is really, really funny. It's full of physical humor, so it was strange to read it because you had to keep in mind all of these different characters and what they were doing at once. It's a play within a play, and they're making fun of farce and how comedic plays are set up. So like part of the play, a large part of it, is written like this, you see, with 2 columns, and these lines designate who's entering and exiting the scene. So it was very difficult to read, but also like in a kind of mind-bendy fun way. But really now I want to watch the film adaptation. We don't get a lot of theater here, and when they do theater, it's usually like the more conventional popular plays, so I won't have a chance to see this live, but I can watch the adaptation, and I am really looking forward to that. Another book that I read in this first half of February is called It Ain't No Sin to Be Glad You're Alive: The Promise of Bruce Springsteen by Eric Alterman. And I talked about this a little bit in my Friday Reads video too, about how I was a little disillusioned about the way that he was taking his biographical details from Springsteen's own words, when Springsteen is kind of notorious for building his own mythos. Well, the book continues to do that, and that was kind of annoying to me. There were also some weird little mistakes in this book. Like, he said that Grapes of Wrath, the film adaptation, was released in 1932, and I thought that that was weird, so I looked it up, and it was actually released in 1940, and it makes me think that there was not very careful fact-checking. That's a really easy mistake to catch, and no one caught it, which is, I think, strange. So I really mistrusted a lot of the information that he was giving me, but his readings of the songs and the way that Bruce Springsteen is this sort of culmination of rock and roll, those were still pretty interesting. And I think it's kind of like, if you love something, if you're kind of obsessed with something, then just reading about it is enjoyable, even though you know that some of it isn't true or some of it is dumb. You just kind of like reading about it. That's how I am with Bruce Springsteen. I'd read anything about him. I'll listen to anything about him. Like, every day I'm checking brucespringsteen.com and backstreets.com. I mean, it's like a problem. So I actually really enjoyed reading it, but I couldn't recommend it to anybody. At some point I'll do a video with my Bruce Springsteen recommendations for the like 3 people that are interested in that as much as I am. But until that point, this would not be the one that I'm recommending. Last month I talked a little bit about how I was reading the comic Fatale by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, and this month I finished that series. There are 5 trade paperbacks in the series, and it has a really satisfying, conclusive ending, so you don't have to worry about like it continuing forever into the future. This is book 3, the cover of book 3, which I just think is super cool. That's the reason I pulled this one up. And the story is just about a femme fatale, as you can imagine, who has kind of extraordinary powers of sexual persuasion. It's a story that has been done before in comics, and also there's kind of this Lovecraftian element to the monsters in the comics that have been done before. But I thought this one had a lot of things to say about sexuality and power and how genders interact and how that is embodied as a kind of responsibility between the genders. And what I mean by that is like she is constantly taking it upon herself to not control men when she does have the power to control men, and she has to kind of contend with how to use that sexual power. Anyway, it's interesting. I would recommend it with hesitation because I do think some of the violence in it is like problematically exploitational, but you know, I have fun reading that kind of stuff, for better or for worse, so I really liked Fatale. And the other comic book that I read was a piece of comics theory. It's called Unflattening by Nick Sousanis. This was actually his dissertation, which I just think is so incredible that he was able to create a comic book for a theoretical dissertation. And the art here is very cool. It's not like the art gets subsumed by the theoretical content. And also, this is probably my favorite book that I've read on comics theory. The ideas here are so complex. He's talking about how comics help us reconfigure our ways of seeing and thinking about the connection between rationality and physicality. Like just for example, here's a page that he uses to talk about sequentiality in comics, and you can see how there are these lines that keep all of the little bits of text together, but then as you get down here, the lines disappear, but you still know how to follow it because the comic has taught you how to follow it. And I think what's so incredible about this book is that he's not always commenting on the theory that he's presenting. Sometimes the theory in the text and the theory in the images are interacting, but they're not illustrating each other, which I just think is so incredible and such a great demonstration of how comics actually work and how words and images have an interplay and connection between them, but that they don't form into a singular language. Okay, so that is everything that I have read in the first 2 weeks of February. This video is coming out a little bit late, but I placed my cutoff date on February 14th. So at the end of the month, I will have a lot more books to talk about, and I'll see you in my next video.